Listen, the sound of a turbocharger screaming its last breath before being swallowed by the black, sulfurous mud of East Texas is a noise that haunts a farmer's sleep for generations. It was late April, and while the rest of the county was celebrating the end of a successful planting season under the warm 2026 sun, Sarah was standing knee-deep in a nightmare. Her grandfather's 500 acres, a stretch of land the locals mockingly called the Dead Pool, was currently claiming its latest victim, a Case IH Steiger 620 that Sarah had poured her entire life savings into just to keep the family name on the mailbox. The massive machine, a titan of American engineering designed to pull through the toughest clay, was now nothing more than a 40-ton anchor sinking into a prehistoric bog. Every time she feathered the throttle, the massive dual tires didn't find traction. They simply milled the earth into a dark, liquid slurry that smelled of ancient decay and wasted money. You could see the audience gathered on the ridge, neighbors in their clean silver pickups, men who had spent 30 years telling her grandfather he was a fool for keeping this worthless swale. They weren't there to help. They were there to witness the final collapse of a legacy. The air was thick with the scent of blooming jasmine and wet diesel, a sharp contrast that defined Sarah's life since she'd returned from the city to claim an inheritance that felt more like a prison sentence. She had 3 days to clear the back taxes or the county would put the deed on the courthouse steps. And right now, her only chance of survival was buried 4 feet deep in the mud. The local machinery dealer, a man named Miller, who had a smile as sharp as a sickle bar, stood by his heavy-duty recovery rig, his arms crossed over a grease-stained jumpsuit. He had already told her the recovery would cost $15,000, cash up front, a price he knew she couldn't pay. It wasn't just a tow. It was a slow-motion execution of her dreams. Sarah looked at the dashboard of the sinking Steiger, the digital displays flickering with warning codes, low oil pressure, transmission slip, hydraulic failure, each one a heartbeat fading away. She remembered her grandfather's dying words about the land, how he'd insisted there was a secret buried beneath the silt. But as the muddy water began to seep into the cab floor, it felt less like a secret and more like a cruel joke played by a man who had lost his way. The humidity of the Texas spring felt like a wet blanket, suffocating her resolve as she watched the waterline rise against the iconic red paint of the hood. If she didn't get this rig out by nightfall, the frame would twist under the pressure of the shifting earth, and she'd be left with a pile of scrap metal and a debt she could never outrun. The silence that followed the engine's final stall was the loudest thing she'd ever heard, broken only by the distant laughter of the men on the ridge who were already planning how they'd split her acreage once the bank took its pound of flesh. They saw a failure, a city girl who didn't know a glow plug from a grease zerk. But as Sarah stared at the swirling eddies in the black water around the rear axle, she noticed something the others had missed, a strange, rhythmic pulsing in the muck that had nothing to do with the sinking tractor. It was as if the earth itself was breathing, pushing back against the heavy steel, and for the first time in weeks, Sarah didn't feel fear. She felt a cold, sharp curiosity. She wasn't just losing a tractor, she was standing on top of a mystery that had swallowed her family's fortune, and she realized that if she was going down, she was going to take the truth of this swamp with her. She reached out and touched the vibrating steering wheel, feeling a hum that resonated deep in her bones, a mechanical frequency that didn't belong to any engine she had ever encountered. Miller stepped off his rig, his boots crunching on the only dry patch of gravel left on the access road. Time was up, and he knew it as well as the birds circling overhead. The Texas sun was beating down now, a relentless May heat that was already starting to bake the top layer of mud into a deceptive, cracked crust, while underneath, the swamp remained a liquid grave. He didn't just want the $15,000 for the recovery. He wanted the lease. He knew that if Sarah couldn't get that tractor out, she couldn't plant. And if she couldn't plant, the bank would be handing him the keys to the whole 500 acres by the end of the week. Sarah stood her ground, her hands stained black with hydraulic fluid, and her face flushed from the humidity, looking at the man who had serviced her grandfather's equipment for 40 years, and was now waiting like a vulture for her to finally break. "You hook it up, Miller, or you get off my land," she retorted. But her voice lacked the steel she felt inside. She knew the numbers better than anyone. The bank had called her 3 times that morning, their voices polite but final. They weren't in the business of financing a swamp, and they certainly weren't going to let a $250,000 tractor disappear into the mud without calling in the entire note. The pressure was a physical weight, heavier than the Steiger itself, pressing against her chest until every breath felt like a struggle against the heavy, wet air of the coastal plains. The recovery crew Miller brought along started unspooling the massive steel cables, the heavy links clanking against the frame of the tow rig with a sound like a funeral bell echoing across the empty fields. They weren't moving to help. They were positioning the snatch blocks to drag the tractor out sideways if they had to, a move that would surely snap the axles and total the machine beyond repair. Miller held out a clipboard, a predatory glint in his eye that suggested he had the paperwork for the land transfer already drafted in his truck. "Sign the equipment over to me to cover the debt, and I'll walk away from the taxes," he offered, his voice dropping to a low, coaxing murmur that was somehow louder than the idling diesel engines. "You're a city girl, Sarah. You weren't built for this heat or this dirt. Go back to where life is easy and let the real farmers handle the dead pool." Around them, the neighbors had climbed out of their trucks, leaning against the tailboards, passing around thermoses of iced tea and watching the show. To them, she was an outsider trying to play a man's game in a place that broke even the strongest legacies. The crop risk wasn't just a future concern, it was an immediate catastrophe. Every hour the Steiger sat in that muck, the moisture was invading the electronics, corroding the sensors, and turning a fixable problem into a total loss that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sarah looked back at the tractor, the massive engine now silent, its cooling fans stopped, looking like a wounded beast in the middle of a black, bubbling lake. She thought about the letters she'd found in her grandfather's desk, mentions of a hidden vein and a pressure valve that made no sense at the time. She realized then that Miller wasn't just after the land for its grazing potential. He knew something about this swamp that he wasn't telling the rest of the county. He was too eager, too willing to forgive a massive debt for a piece of ground everyone else called cursed. The deadline was 5 p.m. If the tractor wasn't on solid ground and the taxes weren't paid, she was done. The tow crew was starting to laugh, cracking jokes about how they'd use the Steiger for parts once Miller took possession of the estate. The humiliation was a hot brand against her skin, but she refused to look away. She noticed the way the water was swirling around the left rear tire, not just settling, but actively being pulled in a direction that defied the natural slope of the land. There was an underground current here, a mechanical or geological force that was fighting the weight of the steel. And she realized that Miller's recovery rig wasn't designed to pull a tractor out of mud. It was designed to keep her from seeing what was happening underneath it. She stepped back toward the sinking cab, ignoring Miller's shouts, her mind racing through every technical manual she'd read since she arrived. She didn't need a tow. She needed to understand why the ground was trying to speak to her in a language of vibration and rising pressure. Sarah didn't climb back into the cab to try the ignition again. She crawled underneath the belly of the beast, her face inches from the black, oily water that was being sucked into a vortex near the transmission housing. She remembered a faded blueprint she'd seen tucked into the back of an old service manual for a 1950s-era Case tractor, a handwritten note from her grandfather about a reverse flow bypass he'd engineered himself. While Miller and his crew were busy adjusting their winches, Sarah reached into the freezing muck, feeling for a specific, out-of-place steel plate she'd noticed during a routine oil change, but had dismissed as a homemade skid plate. It wasn't a skid plate, it was an access hatch to a secondary hydraulic circuit that didn't exist in any factory manual. Her fingers found the rusted wing nuts, and as she twisted them, the smell of pressurized gas and ancient, mineral-rich water erupted from the seal. She realized the Steiger wasn't just stuck, it was being held down by a massive vacuum created by a subterranean pump system her grandfather had installed decades ago to drain the very swamp everyone thought was natural. The engine hadn't stalled because of the mud. It had stalled because the onboard computer couldn't calculate the immense suction force pulling against the frame. She needed to equalize the pressure, but to do that, she had to trick the tractor's 1,000 pound-feet of torque into spinning the hydraulic pump in reverse, a maneuver that would surely blow every seal on the machine if she timed it wrong. She climbed back into the cab, her heart hammering against her ribs like a piston in a dry cylinder. She pulled the side panel off the console, exposing the complex web of wiring harnesses that controlled the tractor's brain. With a pair of rusted wire cutters, she did the unthinkable. She snipped the lead to the main pressure sensor and jumped the connection to the auxiliary PTO circuit using a piece of copper wire from her grandfather's old toolkit. On the ridge, the skeptics watched in confusion as the red lights on the tractor's roof began to flash in a rhythmic, emergency pattern. Miller screamed at her to stop, realizing she was trying to force the machine to do something it wasn't designed for. But Sarah ignored him. She slammed the throttle forward and engaged the auxiliary hydraulics. For a terrifying 10 seconds, the Steiger groaned, a deep, metallic shriek of agony that sounded like a bridge collapsing. Then, suddenly, the black water around the tires didn't just move. It erupted into a 20-foot geyser of clear, sparkling fluid that smelled of salt and something metallic. The tractor didn't move forward, but it began to rise, the massive tires finally gripping the hidden concrete platform of an underground pumping station that had been buried for half a century. The improvised fix was working, but the strain on the Steiger was immense. The engine temp was climbing into the red, and the smell of burning transmission fluid filled the cab. Sarah kept her hand on the lever, feeling the vibration of a massive underground turbine roar to life beneath the mud. She wasn't just pulling a tractor out of a hole. She was jump-starting a dormant industrial giant. The engineers who would arrive days later would call it a geological anomaly, but Sarah knew it was her grandfather's final piece of genius, a way to tap into a high-pressure lithium brine reservoir that the state of Texas didn't even know existed. By using the tractor as a mobile power plant, she had cleared the intake that had been clogged for 30 years. The worthless swamp was receding in real time, pulling back to reveal a landscape not of mud, but of high-grade mineral deposits worth more than every ranch in the county combined. The onlookers were silent now, their iced tea forgotten, as they watched the city girl stand on the hood of a mud-caked, screaming tractor that was literally pumping a fortune out of the earth. She looked at Miller, who stood frozen with his clipboard, and she finally let out a breath she'd been holding since April. The machine hadn't failed her. It had been the key to the vault all along. The geyser didn't stop at 20 feet. It became a roaring pillar of crystalline wealth that washed the black slime off the Steiger's hood like a baptism. The men on the ridge, those same neighbors who had been betting on her failure since the funeral, were now standing in the beds of their trucks, their jaws slack. The laughter was gone, replaced by the low, urgent murmur of men who realized they were looking at a power shift they couldn't control. Miller tried to move in, his face a mask of panicked greed as he realized his chance to steal the deed was evaporating with every gallon of brine that hit the air. He started shouting about property rights and the environmental impact of the discharge, trying to use the law as a final weapon, but Sarah didn't even look at him. She was focused on the gauges, watching the pressure stabilize as the ancient underground infrastructure her grandfather had hidden finally breathed again. Within an hour, a convoy of white SUVs with corporate insignias, the engineers from the State Mineral Board, and a private energy firm she'd quietly contacted weeks ago roared down the access road, their tires kicking up plumes of dust that mingled with the mist of the geyser. They didn't look at the mud. They looked at the sensors in their hands, their faces lighting up with the kind of shock that only comes once in a career. They saw what the farmers couldn't. The highest concentration of lithium-rich brine ever recorded on the North American continent, sitting directly beneath a stretch of land everyone had written off as a tax liability. The reversal was total and immediate. The lead engineer, a man who had seen every oil boom and bust from the Permian to the Gulf, walked right past Miller and tipped his cap to Sarah. He didn't see a girl who had lost a tractor. He saw the owner of the most valuable 500 acres in the state. He knelt by the edge of the receding water, dipping a glass vial into the flow, his eyes fixed on the clarity of the mineral discharge. "This isn't just a discovery," he whispered, loud enough for the men on the ridge to hear. "This is a revolution." The skeptics who had been waiting for the tow rig to drag her away were now climbing down from their trucks, walking toward the fence line with a new, hesitant respect in their eyes. They had seen her fight the mud, seen her rewire a $1 million machine with nothing but a pair of pliers and a dead man's notes. And they had seen the earth reward her for it. The reputation she'd been carrying, the fragile city girl, the failed heir, shattered like glass against the steel of the Steiger. Miller made one last desperate attempt to waive his contract, claiming the salvage rights gave him a stake in the discovery. But Sarah finally stepped down from the cab, her boots hitting the now exposed concrete pad with a heavy, final thud. "You came here for a scrap heap, Miller," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet fields with a clarity that silenced the wind. "But I think you'll find that I don't owe you anything but the gate hitting you on the way out. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long, golden shadows across the clearing swamp, and the sight was nothing short of miraculous. The dead pool was gone, replaced by a complex network of industrial channels and concrete basins that her grandfather had spent a lifetime building in secret, waiting for the technology of the future to catch up to his vision. The neighbors who had once mocked the old man's madness were now looking at their own dry, dusty fields with a sudden sense of smallness. They had played it safe, while the man they called a fool had been building a kingdom beneath their feet. Sarah felt the heat of the afternoon finally breaking, replaced by a cool breeze that felt like a victory lap. She wasn't just the girl who saved the farm. She was the woman who had rewritten the map of Texas. The engineers were already talking about pipelines, extraction permits, and billions of dollars in infrastructure. But Sarah just looked at the Steiger. The red paint was scarred, the tires were caked in white salt deposits, and the engine would need a total overhaul. But it had held together when it mattered most. It wasn't just a piece of machinery. It was the bridge between her past and a future no one else had the courage to see. The humiliation was gone, replaced by a quiet, vibrating power that matched the hum of the brine still surging from the depths. The sun eventually set on that transformative day, but the roar of the brine didn't fade. It became the new heartbeat of the property. By the time the first week of June rolled around, the dead pool was no longer a term of derision, but a name of envy that whispered through every coffee shop and feed store in the state. The county tax office had been paid in full, with Sarah hand-delivering a cashier's check that was so large the clerk had to call a supervisor just to verify the funds. Miller's recovery rig was long gone, as was his reputation. After word got out that he had tried to swindle a grieving granddaughter out of a lithium fortune while her grandfather's legacy was sinking, his dealership's windows were decorated with the silent, cold stares of every farmer in 3 counties who realized they might have been his next victim. But for Sarah, the victory wasn't about the zeros in her bank account or the corporate jets that were now landing at the local airstrip. It was about the silence of the evening when she finally got to sit on her porch, looking out over land that was finally, truly hers. The engineers had moved in with their high-tech sensors and portable rigs, but they worked around her schedule and her rules. They realized quickly that this wasn't just a mineral site. It was a legacy that had been defended with grease, sweat, and a refusal to back down when the world said she was beaten. The Steiger 620 didn't stay in the mud for long. Sarah didn't hire Miller's crew to pull it out. She called in a team of specialized heavy recovery experts from Houston, who treated the machine with the respect it deserved. When they finally winched it onto the concrete pad, the sight was a testament to the brutality of the struggle. The frame was caked in salt, the dual tires were scarred, and the electronics had been fried by her improvised bypass. But as the master mechanic looked over the damage, he didn't see a total loss. He saw a hero. It took 6 weeks and a team of 3 mechanics working round the clock in her grandfather's old workshop to bring the Titan back to life. They replaced every sensor, flushed every hydraulic line, and rebuilt the transmission from the ground up. But Sarah insisted on one thing. The scratches on the hood and the slight dent in the grille stayed. They were the scars of the battle that had saved the farm. When she finally climbed back into the cab and turned the key, the engine didn't just start. It sang. It was a deep, resonant rumble that shook the very foundation of the shop, a signal to everyone within 5 miles that the queen of the Texas mineral boom was back in the driver's seat. She didn't buy a fleet of new tractors with her new fortune. She kept the one that had stood by her when the water was rising, proving that in the world of heavy iron, loyalty is forged in the toughest conditions. The final lesson of the Deadpool wasn't about the lithium, or the millions of dollars that would flow from the pipes for the next 50 years. It was about the vision of a man who saw a future others were too blind to imagine, and the courage of a woman who was willing to get her hands dirty to prove him right. Sarah stood at her grandfather's grave on the ridge, the very spot where the skeptics had watched her sink, and she placed a small, polished piece of the lithium brine crystal on his headstone. She realized then that the worthless swampland was never a curse. It was a filter, designed to wash away those who didn't have the grit to see what lay beneath the surface. The engineers called her the richest woman in Texas, but as she looked out at the Steiger idling in the distance, its lights cutting through the twilight like beacons, she knew her true wealth was the knowledge that she could face the impossible and come out the other side with her head held high. Farming isn't just about what you can grow in the soil. It's about what you can endure when the soil tries to take everything from you. It's about the machines that bridge the gap between human will and the raw power of the earth. Sarah had found her treasure, but more importantly, she had found herself in the very place everyone else told her to run from. If you could inherit a piece of worthless land tomorrow, would you have the heart to dig deep enough to find the truth? Or would you walk away before the first drop of rain even fell? Tell us in the comments, what's the most valuable thing you've ever found hidden in a piece of old machinery or an abandoned plot of land?